Hi, hello everybody. If everyone can have a seat. I'm going to start off by saying that we do have a mask policy at our classroom. So if you do have a mask on you, it'd be great if you could mask up, please. Thank you. My name's Peter Kicker. I'm an assistant professor in the public policy and governance program here at StFX and the Irving Shipbuilding Chair in Arctic Policy with the Mulroney Institute of Government. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd also like to start by thanking you all for joining us on the first Mulroney Institute Fellows Lecture of 2023. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Louis Groarke, who I think everyone knows, I'm guessing, in the room here, but he's from the Department of Philosophy. His talk, Arts, Politics, and Caravaggio, will explore the connections, the intersections between visual art and politics, particularly how understanding the political sensibilities of an era can better help us understand the art. An internationally renowned and prolific author and scholar, speaker in the field of philosophy, Dr. Groarke's extensive body of research focuses on political theory, moral philosophy, aesthetics, logic, Aristotle, and the history of philosophy. His books include Moral Reasoning, Rediscovering the Ethical Tradition, The Good Rebel, Understanding Freedom and Morality, and Ideas Under Fire, Historical Studies of Philosophy and Science in Adversity, really highlighting the diversity of his research portfolio. We are certainly lucky to have Dr. Groarke for the Institute's kickoff lecture of 2023. Join me in thanking and welcoming him.
Thank you very much for the introduction. This is all very new to me. I don't usually teach with PowerPoint, and I've got a microphone, so hopefully things will go well. Be sure you're sitting somewhere where you get a good view of the slides, of the pictures. This is a picture show. It's not what philosophers usually do. We talk about ideas. I am going to talk about ideas. I'm going to talk about politics and art, but you can't really talk about art intelligibly unless you look at it. So really what I've done is I've sort of organized a presentation of what I think is in many cases gorgeous art, but trigger warning, some gruesome art too. Art deals with the beautiful, but it also deals with the grotesque, the ugly, and the horrible. I'm going to talk about politics and art, and politics as a struggle for power between groups. And yeah, it gets dirty, grimy, nasty, and it gets very interesting. This is the painting that I'm talking about, but I'm going to talk more generally about how politics influences art, and how, this is a talk for the Mulroney Institute, how important it is to understand the politics of an era if you want to appreciate, for example, what's going on in a painting like this, which is a religious painting, and it's a very deep painting. It's got many levels of meaning, but there is a political side to it. And it's so important to understand politics, to keep it in mind. It permeates everything we do in a culture. And so I want to use this as an example to make the point that even when we're studying art, doing aesthetics, philosophy of art, doing art history, you can't forget about the political. The political is absolutely essential. I thought at first when I was asked to give the lecture, I do political philosophy. I could talk about communitarianism, liberalism, or rights, individual rights. Here's a good question: how much right does the government have to impose upon people who are against the COVID vaccine? A COVID vaccine. I do all sorts of stuff like that, but I thought, hey, pictures are fun and art is really, really interesting. So I'm doing something a little bit different than I'm usually doing. I want to make a few thank yous. I want to thank the Mulroney Institute for inviting me. I want to thank the university and the Faculty of Arts. I have a Leger chair, research chair. It's very helpful. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to put together a talk. So I really do appreciate sometimes, a little bit of extra time to do that. I want to thank you for coming out, my students, my department. I think I need to mention in particular one member of my department. The students know, because we have philosophy events at my apartment on campus, I have a statue. I have a statue of one of the members of our department. He's here, Ed Cardy. And I did want to mention Ed Cardy on Tuesday received the Platinum Jubilee Medal, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Medal at the Government House in Halifax. So thank you for coming, Ed, and kudos to you. Okay, so now we're going to see if I can get this to work. It's not working. Nope. Will this one work? Well, hold on. Okay. Do I have to do anything particular?
No, I just need to tell it.
Okay. So I thought I better a synopsis of what we're going to do. I do apologize. The talk is a little bit long. Professor Curry told me, Louis, make it short. It's a little bit long. Why? Because we're going to look at pictures, and pictures take time to look at, and they're fascinating. I'll try not to say too much about the pictures, but we have to say something. Basically, this is what we're going to do today. I'll just introduce the painting very quickly, explain the thesis, what I'm going to argue. I always tell the students, you have to define your terms. I will define what I mean by politics and by art. It's pretty clear what I mean by art, but politics, I do want to define it a little bit, what I'm trying to get at. I'll look at propaganda and art. I'm not really going to focus on that. That's not what I'm interested in, but that's kind of up there to show what I'm not interested in. Then we'll take a little trip down the lane to the Northern Renaissance. I just want to look very briefly at Albert Dürer, kind of in comparison with Riviera, to show the kind of thing I'm interested in general. And what I'm interested in is Caravaggio and how the politics of the day, once we understand them, help us to appreciate and understand what's going on in a very beautiful and famous painting. So then I'm going to talk about the Counter-Reformation. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to do more history than philosophers usually do, because you can't understand the art unless you understand the era. I actually like to do this. Oftentimes in political philosophy, we get involved in discussions. And of course, when we talk about the contemporary world, there are biases on every side, right? The cultural wars, you're on the left, you're on the right. I don't know, you're a secular humanist, you're a religious person. I don't know, you voted NDP or you voted conservative. In a way, when we go back in history, we can get rid of all that, and we can just look at what's happening with a much more distant, a much more aloof and disinterested way. We can look at what's happening and try to understand what's going on. In this case, I want to understand what's going on in the period. And then I'm going to talk about the Contralli Chapel, which is where Caravaggio's painting is, and explain sort of how it came to be. Look at a few examples of paintings from Caravaggio, and then look at the calling of St. Matthew and try to solve the problem, who is St. Matthew in the painting? Because as of late, there's a big discussion about that. And I'm going to say, really, the way to figure out who St. Matthew is in the painting is to understand the politics of the era. And when you understand the politics and the reason why the painting was made, Caravaggio is a very clever, smart artist, then it becomes apparent who must be Matthew and who isn't Matthew. And then if we have time, I'll do a little addenda. So hopefully this works. So there's the painting. You should go to Rome and it's a painting by Michelangelo Caravaggio. He comes from a little town in northern Italy. That's why he's called Caravaggio. It's called The Calling of St. Matthew. I'm going to talk about what's going on in the painting, not yet. The French title is actually, I think, a little bit better. The French title is La Vocation de Saint Matthieu. And it's really about Matthew being called to become a disciple, Matthew the tax collector, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk about it. It's about 1600. It was Caravaggio's first big success. He had come as a very sort of a poor boy from northern Italy, and he made it with his painting. It was celebrated. It was beloved. And by the way, if you go to Rome and say it is it's a big oil painting. It's a gorgeous painting. It's in St. Louis of France. That's the church, the French church in Rome. That's where it is. And it really heralds sort of Baroque art after the Renaissance and Mannerism. I just wanted to show you, I'm not going to say much about this slide. I actually have a degree in art history. I had the degree a long time ago. What's this slide about? This is some qualifications I want to make. The first thing I want to say is we're going to look at a lot of paintings. With apologies to Sharon and the art historians, of course, there's all sorts of things to say about these paintings. There's formal things like how they use the light and the composition, and there's about the materials they use. And so there's just too much to say. I am going to focus on one particular issue, the political aspect here. And in each slide, I put the artist, I put the date. Sometimes I won't even mention the artist because I want to make a point about politics. But why did I put 3 pictures of the painting up? When I was a young man in art history, I had a degree in art history, and I had an art historian professor who refused to use color pictures. And the reason he refused to use color picture is because he said the color is always off. Now, if you look, I think this is going to work. Look, for example, the color there, there, and there. You know, that's the same painting, and it's taken, of course, from one angle here, but here you look on it on the internet, you look at it on a little art history book. All I want to say is here, we have to be very, very careful. You know, you don't get a sense of the size, but this is what we have to use. It's what I have to use. That's fine. But, you know, my art history scruples, I just want to make the point. You know, if you really want to figure out this painting, you need to go to Rome and look at it. And that's not even enough. Actually, with Caravaggio, I'll mention a little bit about this. You probably have to do a forensic examination and study it. But notice there we've got 3 pictures of the same painting. And, you know, this one's yellow, this one's pink, this one's sort of white, whatever. Just let's remember that as we're going through. We have to be careful about the images we look at. All right, I say to my students to define terms. I want to define two terms, art and politics. Let me start with art. It's pretty straightforward what I'm talking about. I'm talking about visual art. I actually have an article out there that defines art. I say art has something to do with the intersection of skill. Delight means it's a technical term, something we take pleasure in. It doesn't necessarily mean that art is always fun. We can have, as we'll see, art which is horrible, which is, purposely horrible, which evokes feelings of what's called the sublime. Usually that term delight means art. Fine art is something we can appreciate on its own account. And sometimes people make a distinction between instrumental value in art and intrinsic value in art. You might say I'm looking at instrumental value. I'm going to say that this painting we're looking at has a political purpose, quite apart from the aesthetic, the formal aspects of the painting. It serves a political purpose. I actually think, if you were to ask me, we were doing aesthetics, those two things come together. In the modern world, we cut things apart and we analyze them. But so what do I mean? Skillful displays intended for enjoyment and contemplation. In this case, Caravaggio is a religious painter. He's painting religious paintings. Yeah, contemplation even in a religious sense. In fact, what Caravaggio is doing is he's trying to get an effect from his audience, a kind of a sensational effect. He was very proud of it, and he was very successful at it. So I'm talking about, you go to the National Gallery and you see paintings up there. That's what I mean by art. It's not very complicated. This is just after the Renaissance. This is the Counter-Reformation. Art becomes a really big deal. Fine art, painting. But I don't think I really need to say much about that, but I do need to say about how I'm using the term politics. And I've got a bit of a definition. Power struggles between identifiable groups. So when I'm talking about politics, I'm not talking about you're a member of a political party. You're running for the Liberal Party, or you voted Democrat in the last American election, or you're a member, you're a bureaucrat in Ottawa, or you've written letters to your MP about that. No, I'm talking about something much more basic. What happens in society is that we get groups, and there's a struggle for power. And these groups struggle with one another. And in the Counter-Reformation that we're going to look at, this is, politics and religions are sort of smashed together and come together. But all I mean by politics is group identification in terms of a struggle. Who controls society? Who decides how society is organized, what we do, what we believe in, whatever? And what you find is that in those power struggles, art is a very useful tool, and art is often employed to champion one side or the other, and that's what I'm talking about. Now notice, I thought I better write this: partisan loyalty is on display. So somebody paints a painting and they painted with a political, but I don't necessarily mean this is a bad thing. Politics is part of life. And, you can't get away from it, whatever society you're in, whatever age you're in. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a fact of human nature, of human society, of human history. We have these power struggles. And when we look at art, sometimes we have to take into account, if we want to really understand it, we have to take into account what's going on in terms of the politics. This is Diego Rivera. He's a famous Mexican muralist. This is a painting that he did. It was actually destroyed, but for the Rockefeller Center in New York, it was too communist. Here's another painting by him. Clearly, he was a Marxist. You've got Trotsky up there, you've got Marx up there. I don't want to say a lot about this. He thought he was making working class art for the people. He believed in the Marxist ideology. You know, these are the bad capitalists. These are the good workers all uniting in, you know, in the fourth, I think it is, International. This is political art. He's a good artist. He had good technique, and he paints some very impressive painting. But this is not really what I'm looking at today. Yvon Grenier, who sent me nicely a message from Puerto Rico and said he couldn't be here, but he studies this kind of thing. And you can have art, and it can be almost propaganda. You know, Riviera is, you know, it's in your face. You can't miss it. What this painting is about politics. I'm missing a slide. Okay. I'm going to talk about a different kind of way in which politics seeps into art. And I just took Albert Dürer as another example. You could pick sort of almost any example. I'm interested when the art doesn't seem to be political. And yet it actually is political when you look more carefully. I mean, it's obvious when you've got somebody like Riviera, obviously you can't understand what he's doing unless you understand the politics. But it's not so obvious, for example, when you look at Albert Dürer. This is his engraving of Adam and Eve. It's a fabulous engraving. I've seen it. But it's not so possible that there's any politics there. I'm going to show you politics in the sense I'm talking about, as sort of a pledge of allegiance to a group. Yeah, it's even in here. When I was a young man and I took art history, I liked Dürer very much, and I looked at the painting. And there's one thing I couldn't figure out the painting. The painting is really about the four humors. So, for example, the cow is the phlegmatic humor, the elk is the melancholy humor, the rabbit is the sanguine humor, the cat is the choleric humor, and it's all about the fall, right? They're about to eat not the apple, but the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You can see a little ram up on the top. He's ready to fall through the precipice. Anyways, but Dürer is showing off his skill at how good he's at engraving and, you know, what he can do. And there's something that I looked at. I saw this for years, and look at that serpent. There are four skinny, funny protuberances poking out of the head of that. That's not realistic. Serpents don't look like that. And really, for years, I wondered, what's going on there? Why does the serpent, of course, represents the devil? He's Satan. He's practically handing the apple to Eve. It's the beginning of our downfall, the downfall of humanity. Dürer, by the way, he's a Catholic. He's got some Protestant sympathies too. What is that funny, thing that's going on with the serpent's head? Well, here's, I won't go into exactly the source. This is a 18th century source. What Dürer is going on to is, and what those are supposed to represent, it turns out, is that when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified with 4 nails, not with 3. And that doesn't seem like a very, exciting issue nowadays. I don't think that we're all very concerned about it. But in fact, the idea that Jesus was crucified with only 3 nails at one time was declared a heresy. It was declared as the wrong way to think about the crucifixion. Here is a little quote from George Stanley Faber. It's a history book about theology. Lucas of Tuy in the 13th century tells us that the world had turned to many false opinions. He specially enumerates the unsound tenet unauthoritatively advanced by other sects that 3 nails only were used in the crucifixion. The last opinion was advocated from the latter end of the 11th century, but Pope Innocent III finally and infallibly determined that 4 nails were used. I'm assuming that's true, I'm not sure. A decision which, of course, stamped the brand of heresy on triclavianism. So that's why that's there, because jurors saying, look, I know, you know, those people that believed in the 3 nails, they're wrong. There's the devil, and of course he's got the 4 nails because he's the you know, the source of wickedness that eventually ended up with Christ nailed with 4 nails on Calvary. So that's why that's in the painting. It's a pledge of allegiance. I'm not a heretic. I'm not on the wrong side. I believe in the 4 nails. That's what that's going on. That's what I mean by politics. And I think Donna's here. Donna, it's interesting. One of the issues that comes up is they talk about St. Francis of Assisi in this theological discussion, and they say the stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi proved that there were only, that there were 4 nails and not only 3. But we will leave theological niceties aside. Quickly, I just want to show one other example. This is, of course, Doubting Thomas, Albert Durr. I don't know about you, but you see Doubting Thomas sticking his hand into the side of Jesus. That looks pretty uncomfortable to me. I wouldn't want Professor Schlack to stick in his hand in there. I mean, I don't know. You look at that and you say, oh, okay, well, it's a religious painting and it's, you know, it's illustrating the Bible story. In fact, it's more than that. It turns out in the Reformation, this is just when the Reformation is starting. It turns out that the Protestants believed that Doubting Thomas, the scripture story is very brief, doesn't say much. The Protestants believed that Thomas, once he saw the nails, that was enough. He was satisfied. He didn't poke his hand into the wound of Christ. The Catholics, who are always very central and sort of earthy and whatever, they thought that no, and there were big debates about this. I know this seems like a rather minor thing to us, but there were big debates. The Catholic said, no, actually, he stuck his fingers right in there, you know, into the flesh to figure it out. So there again, what you see, I'm going to talk about this again in a minute, but see, there's a badge there. There's a symbol. There's something that's saying, see, no, I believe that, you know, if you want to interpret the story correctly, no, he stuck his hand way in there and he felt that flesh. And so there's a statement being made. Now, of course, I'm talking about religious things, and we live in a secular society, perhaps we do. But back then, religion and politics and, you know, worldly power, it's all messed up together. It's all whatever. These are not just religious issues. These are also political issues. So we got art, fine art. Durr is just a lovely artist. But let's turn now and quickly look at the counter Reformation. This is Clement VIII. I don't know where the painting's from. It's from an unknown artist. Some of you might like Pope Clement. He was kind of a tough law and order guy. He is in some sense the patron saint of coffee drinkers. Why of coffee drinkers? Well, it seems that coffee was then introduced to Italy. They didn't have a coffee before. And, you know, I don't know why. It was too bitter, too strong. It was maybe an aphrodisiac. So it was called Satan's drink. And it seems, this is a story, Clement VIII declared, why this Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let infidels have the exclusive use of it. Supposedly, he said this around 1600, around the time that of the painting that we're going to talk about. Perhaps he thought that coffee was better than liquor. I don't know. But anyways, that's one story about him. So who is he? He's the Pope. During the Counter-Reformation, let's talk a little bit about this. It's the Catholic response to Protestantism, okay? And it's not just religious. There are wars, there are atrocities. There's all sorts of things going on. Protestants versus Catholics, who's got the right way of thinking about things. He comes along and he's a very strict law and order Pope, as I'll explain, and he declares in 1600 a Jubilee year. A Jubilee year is where you can get indulgences if you take a pilgrimage to Rome. And in fact, no, he's doing it in reaction to, he's all worried. He's particularly worried about the French. But he's worried about people falling away from Catholicism and Protestants taking over. And so he declares a Jubilee year, 1600. They say 1.5 million people flocked to Rome. The population of Rome doubled in size. It was good for the Roman business, but it was always good, also good for Catholicism. One of the things he did is he asked all the cardinals and all the bishops and the priests to, decorate their churches, buy art. There were all sorts of events, et cetera, et cetera. And Caravaggio's painting is part of this, because Caravaggio's painting was, it went up in 1600 for the Jubilee. Actually, it was a big success, and I'll say more about this. Again, this isn't just religious. Here is a little quote from a history book, and he's talking about the Counter-Reformation. Active conversion was highly appropriate for a church that served the French Catholics. The fact that France was still a part Protestant or was in part Protestant or heretical troubled Pope Clement VIII deeply, and he considered Pope Henry IV's conversion to Catholicism in 1595, 5 years earlier, a major diplomatic success for himself. The intensity of the Pope's desire to convert others in France is made explicit in his 1599 bull, in which he directed all French bishops to give this mission their full attention. The Pope's instructions to papal nuncios also included passionate exhortations to procure the conversion of heretics, probably Protestants, and the increase of the Catholic religion with every study and all possible energy. So, sure, I'm going to talk about a time where religion is very important, but it's all mixed up in politics. We have the Jubilee year. Famously, it's when Giordano Bruno, the scholar, the philosopher, the theologian, he was burned at the stake in 1600. Notice power struggles. He was found guilty by the Inquisition. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We tend to romanticize these things. When I looked up on the history, it actually was only a little blip in the Jubilee year. It wasn't something people really focused on. To give you a sense maybe of why, here's another discussion from a history book on criminal justice in Rome. This is so, and Clement VIII had this reputation of coming and being a law and order guy, reestablishing order. On capture, robbers faced immediate execution. Executions were held in the piazza joining Pont Saint D'Angelo, and the severed heads were displayed on the bridge as a dreadful warning to passers-by. Sometimes, said the Romans, there were more heads on the bridge than melons in the marketplace. Violence and robbery were not only crimes punishable by death. Incest, abortion, and pederasty carried the same penalty. But the cardinals managed to prevent the Pope, Clement VIII, from extending the death penalty to adultery. Sabbath breakers, like if you didn't go to mass on Sunday, risked being sent to the galleys to spend the rest of your life at the oars. And rumor mongers were liable to have their tongues cut off. No crime could be written off. And it was a popular Roman joke that the Pope would punish St. Peter, if he could, for cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. So pretty tough times. The Pope comes in and he declares the Jubilee, and they redecorate Rome. And again, I can't say enough about some of these works. Well, you've got to, you know, make Rome sort of a good place for tourists and for people, whatever. So what are you going to do? Well, if you're Catholic, of course, the Protestants are very, sort of very hostile to images, but Catholics, no, we're going to have lots and lots. So they paint a bunch of churches. This has been going on. And here's, I won't go too much into the painting, but this is a fresco. It's angels, it's putti, it's little angels. And you notice they are carrying some maybe wicked implements. What's going on here? These are angels, and they're carrying instruments of torture. And what, you know, and why these things happen, you know, it becomes the craze in Rome to celebrate martyrdom. And what this is it's a little balustrade, and you can see very sharp, nasty tools that the people, that the angels are carrying. Of course, it's a triumphant parade. They're carrying the glory of the martyrs. Here is kind of a typical sort of a painting. It's in a little rural church. It's not a very important church. The martyrdom of Saint Simon the Apostle they're not exactly sure who did this, but by minor, he's getting sawn in half. And this kind of craze this happens in art. You know, Edmund Burke's Sublime covers it. Rome just, I don't know, sort of fell in love, and you had all these decorations, and a big important part of these decorations was to show how the martyrs died for their Catholic faith. This is Saint Vitaly, and this is, which saint is it? Vitalis, he's on the rack. You can see the rack, they're stretching him out. It's like you go to the chiropractor, you see the wheel there, they're pulling him apart, whatever. The worst church is, I would say worse, I don't know if it's worse. I think these things have to be understood. The Hungarians, there's a Hungarian church, a Saint Stefano. The pictures were so lurid. I was going to show them. I thought, no, people haven't eaten supper yet. I better not do that. But okay, so we go iconography. What's going on? What's fascinating about this is that there's two ways of reading this. There's a Catholic way and there's a Protestant way. Again, notice this is all mixed up with the politics of the era. Maybe I will read. I'm worried a little bit about time. This is Charles Dickens, and he's talking about Saint Stefano, who is the church which is decorated with these kinds of things. Of course, he has a wonderful flair. Dickens didn't like Catholics. He says, he's describing the church, a damp, mildewed vault of an old church in the outskirts of Rome, notable by reasons of the hideous paintings with which its walls are covered. These represent the martyrdoms of saints and early Christians, and such a panorama of horror and butchery no man can imagine in his sleep, though he were to eat a whole pig raw. Gray-bearded men being boiled, fried, grilled, crimped, singed, eaten by wild beasts, worried by dogs, buried alive, torn asunder by horses, chopped up with small hatchets, women having their breasts torn with iron pinchers. By the way, gender things, there's lots of women that are in these pictures. It's, you know, they're women martyrs, they're men martyrs, their tongues cut off, their ears screwed off, their jaws broken, their bodies stretched upon the rack, or skinned upon the stake, or crackled up and melted in the fire. Dickens says, these are among the mildest subjects. So this is what's going on. What's going on? I want to very quickly say there's sort of two ways of looking at this. The Protestants, like Dickens, thought this was horrendous and morbid and titillating, and it's the typical Roman Catholic desire for sensuous images. Look where it leads. And they also thought that rack up there, they thought it was a warning. You better not be a Protestant. You better not speak out against the Inquisition. Why? Because this kind of thing is going to happen to you. It turns out that the guy that's on the rack there at St. Vitali, he was a common criminal. Everybody knew who he was. He was somebody who had murdered his father with his sister. But so the Protestants said, yeah, like if you're not careful, those inquisitors, they're going to get hold of you. It's a threat. It's a political threat. Don't speak out against Catholicism or this will happen to you. The Catholic view of it was no. In fact, there were religious wars going on. The St. Stefano that Dickens talks about, it was a Jesuit seminary. And good numbers of those seminarians were martyred. And the idea was, look at how courageous these are there. It's sort of like Martin Luther King, who died for a good cause. Look at how strong and persevering and, you know, tough they were. They died for their faith. It's a glorious thing. Now, you Jesuit seminarians, when you go out to Germany, and this might be happen to you, yeah, it might happen to you, and it's a glorious thing. Get ready for it. You can do it too, and of course, you'll be rewarded in heaven. So it's kind of very interesting. You can take the same art, and you can read it in two different ways. So now let's try to say a little bit about Caravaggio. This is San Luigi dei Francesi. So this is St. Louis of France. You know, what happens in Rome is that there are national churches. This is the French church. You can see this is the outside of it. You've got the French coat of arms on the top. During the Jubilee year, you know, I was thinking, how can I explain this to people? What it's like? It was sort of like Expo 67. I know for the students that doesn't mean anything, but every country had their own sort of, pavilion, right? And so China tries to outdo the United States, which tries to, that's what happened in Rome there. And so you've got all these different churches. And what do we do? Well, the pilgrims are coming and it's a big deal. Let's spruce them up and let's get them ready for the Jubilee. And this is inside that church. This is the chapel we're going to, with the painting, we're going to be looking at it. It's looked at from the nave. You know, there's a main altar and then there are side chapels. And in one of these side chapels, the Contrelli Chapel, we find Caravaggio's painting. And I just wanted to show you quickly what it looks like, in the context. There's a nice picture of the chapel. There are actually three paintings, all of them by Caravaggio. The Martyrdom of St. Matthew, Inspiration of St. Matthew, and the one we're going to look at is on the left right here. It's a small chapel. It's named the Contrelli Chapel because of the cardinal who paid for it and who's buried there, as we'll talk about eventually. Okay. I don't know if this is going too far. The the Baroque and Renaissance are very clever and very careful what they represent. There's one author out there, he's actually very good, Troy Thomas, and he says that's supposed to be a fleur de lis. It's a money bag that's on St. Matthew's table. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Well, the fleur de lis, or the fleur de lis, I think in English, that's the French symbol. And he also says, well, that's really Catholicism because it's, you got to give your money. It's not just faith. You got to do good works, whatever. I'm not sure what I think about it, but certainly this is a very French chapel. The ceiling, it's the apotheosis of Louis, King of France. There's a monument to French soldiers. There's this fleur de lis all over the place, whatever. So we'll come back to it. Caravaggio, I want to say he's a political painter. This is Caravaggio. This is a gorgeous painting. Again, I can't say enough about it, but we just want to look at the finger. This is Caravaggio's version of Doubting Thomas. And if you look carefully, even not that carefully, what's happening with that finger? Well, that's getting inserted pretty damn deeply into the wound. In fact, some art historians think that Caravaggio got his idea from the print of Albert Dürer, but you see, there's that finger. Actually, Jesus is taking his hand and forcing it in, and that's the Catholic way of understanding what happened. It's not the Protestant way. Look at the highlight, right? I mean, the way he uses color, whatever. But so we've got what seems like a religious painting. It's a beautiful painting. There's lots of things to be said about it. But what I just want, there's that badge. Hey, this is a Catholic painting. It's not a Protestant painting. There's a loyalty. And of course, he's being paid by Catholics, right? He's very counter-Reformation, very Roman Catholic. He wants to be a religious painter. So of course, you got to paint what your patrons want. Here's another lovely painting of Mary, the baby Jesus, and Saint Anne, her mother. And again, because I don't have time to go into all sorts of very interesting details, I just want to focus in laser on one aspect. Again, a political aspect. Right? There's this struggle between Protestants and Catholics. You look at a painting, which side he's on. Well, of course, it's a painting. It's a holy painting that at this time, that's probably Catholic. It was intended for a church. But what I want you to look at with this work is down there. So it's Mary and Jesus, and Anne is looking from the side, and they're stepping on the serpent. And the serpent is, of course, the devil, and they're crushing its head. Notice they're doing it with, that's a dangerous, poisonous. They're doing it in bare feet. I don't advise you go to Colorado, where you used to live, and step on rattles with bare feet. That would probably not be a good idea. Of course, it's to show the kind of paradoxical inversion. Part of Christianity is that the weak of the world, the vulnerable, those who are not powerful, in the end, they are the key to salvation, and they're the ones that make God triumph. But what I want you to look at, if you look there, there's something there. I mean, there's all sorts of other reasons, but there's something here that any Protestant theologian would be very upset with. Who's the first person standing on the snake's head? It's Mary. It's not Jesus. Caravaggio was very influenced by the Franciscans. The Franciscans came up with this idea of Mary as co-redemptrix. Mary played this big role in salvation. And I'm not taking sides here. We're just trying to understand what's going on. They thought Catholics they accused them of idolatry, and of course of worshiping Mary, of putting Mary on an equal basis with Jesus, and that's horrendous and terrible. She's not even here on an equal basis with, she's first. She's prior. Jesus, she's protecting you, and she's crushing the serpent. You can look at that, and that's clearly, it's a religious painting. It's meant to be religious, but it's also a political painting. It's on the Catholic side. So let's go now. How am I doing for time? I got about 15 minutes, okay? About 15 minutes. Let's go to the painting that I want to talk about, the calling of St. Matthew. Let me just peek ahead for a second. Okay. So first of all, let me explain what's going on in the painting. It is, we could say, a realistic painting. It's painted in the costumes of the time. Now, what it is we have Jesus. Jesus is on the side, and when he's beside St. Peter, and he's got his hand reached out, and we've got a table. We've got the table, so there's Jesus, there's St. Peter, we've got a table. It's really a table filled with thugs. Somewhere among there, one of them is St. Matthew, and we've got some swords, and they're supposed to be ruffians, young ruffians. And the idea is that, you know, that nasty St. Matthew, he's a tax collector. He's a publican. What do you do if you're a tax collector and people don't want to pay? Well, you know, when I worked with street people at one point, and somebody said to me, well, you know, Louis, if you don't pay, they break your knees. Yeah. These are enforcers. Now, we have romantic notions and all the rest. This is very interesting. You can ask me in the period if you want. This is actually a policeman's drawing of a sword that was confiscated from Caravaggio. It wasn't, and this is just a little piece of detail of a painting with another dog. Caravaggio loved swords. He was kind of a rough guy. He was maybe a thug. You can ask me about it. We get the wrong idea. You weren't allowed to carry a sword in those days, Richard. You couldn't carry a sword. It was like carrying a revolver. You had to be a special person and have a permit. You couldn't just carry around a sword. So actually, this drawing is from a little police report. It's like Caravaggio, look, this is the sword he had. He broke the law, whatever. So what do we have? What we have is, there's Jesus, there's St. Peter, of course, because it's Catholic. Here we have a group of thugs, and traditionally it was thought that was St. Matthew, and now there's a debate whether that is St. Matthew. And we'll talk more about it. Let's see if I can get this working. Of course, and there's more into this painting than I can say, so I'm sorry for the art historians. I know there's way more to say than I'm going to say, but of course, notice. So again, let's just look at the political side of it. Okay, this is the Reformation. What is Caravaggio doing? Well, of course, you can see that Jesus' hand, it's the hand, by the way, it's the hand of Adam in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Caravaggio is very influenced by Michelangelo, but it's, you know, it's God become man. So it's not the hand of God. In fact, if you look carefully, what looks to be much more like the hand of God is the hand, this hand right here, this hand right there is St. Peter. Well, why is that? Well, because the Roman Catholic Church with the Pope is the authority, the God-given authority. It's very interesting. When Caravaggio first painted the painting, he didn't put St. Peter in. And they've done forensic work, and they found out he put St. Peter in afterwards. He was the last thing to put in the painting. Because, of course, Peter has to be there. That's the voice of God, the authoritative, you know, religious, you know, it's that there. And he has to be there too. And then we have Jesus, of course, the sun setting in the west. It's kind of interesting. The church itself is oriented west-east, not east-west. It's the end of the day. The toughies have done their job. They've, you know, threatened people and they've gotten their monies. And what's going on? What's going on is they're collecting their money. They're doing some sort of shady business before the sun goes down in a back alley in Rome. What I want to talk about, I guess, so much to talk about, there's a debate. The traditional view was that this was St. Matthew. Right now, there's a view, a contestatory view, that the young man sitting at the end of the table is St. Matthew. And I could read out, I would say there's about a dozen scholars on each side. I don't think, because as always, we run out of time, I won't go into the scholarly details, just understand. I will mention one authority, one person that says that St. Matthew, the old traditional view is wrong. And what the original idea was that Matthew was pointing at himself, the light streaming on him. He's saying, oh, Jesus, you're calling me. The new view is that actually that finger is pointing at that figure, young man looking down. And there's all sorts of reasons they give. I'll talk about a few of them. The only person I'll mention is, I'm sorry, I'm going to contradict him for devout cats out there. The Pope says that's St. Matthew. Pope Francis has said that's St. Matthew. I'm afraid I'm going to screw the Pope and say he's got that wrong. There's some arguments on both sides. What effectively am I going to say? I'm going to say, you understand the politics of the piece, then you can figure out that old guy has to be Matthew. But the way to understand it, and there's, in scholarship, when we do things, all the evidence starts to accumulate and come together and all the rest. But the key to figuring this out, this puzzle, who St. Matthew, is to understand the political background. And again, basically, I want to say politics is important. Those who want to say this is St. Matthew, they point to, this is St. Matthew from Leonardo's Last Supper, and they want to draw a connection between that. Caravaggio often used images from other people, and they want to say, well, see, that's St. Matthew and that's St. Matthew. And they want to say that St. Matthew should be younger. The old man is too old. Or they say, we'll look more closely at the picture, that what the young man is doing in the picture is more like St. Matthew. Okay, so I want to show, no, I think that's wrong. Why is that wrong? There are some artistic reasons to show why. There's the traditional, the detail of the traditional. Caravaggio tended to use certain facial types, certain models. And when he does say these are other paintings of St. Matthew, he tends to focus in on this kind of a face. Again, here's typical Caravaggio, very dramatic guy. This is Judith beheading Holofernes. And where does he picture it? Just as she's cutting off, this Old Testament story, the blood's, pouring out and everything like that. If we go back, there's the martyrdom of St. Matthew in the same chapel. You see the blood spurting out, whatever. If we go back to the painting, what you'll notice is that the old guy you look at his legs and he's sort of half ready to come out. He's pointing, he's looking. The young man is looking down. He's meditative. It's like he hasn't seen the light. He's still in the darkness. But Caravaggio liked to capture just the instant when the action was happening. By the way, what's the painting about? I think it's fair to say it's about a Franciscan notion of irresistible grace. God comes to anybody, even if you're a dastardly tax collector, you can be the worst person, and in an instant, you can't see it very well on the painting. Jesus' feet are already turning to walk away. He doesn't have to do anything. He just points and zoom, bang. It's like lightning strike, you're converted. What seems to be happening is this person down here doesn't seem to be part of the action. Caravaggio had followers. He was very popular at the time, the Caravaggisti. They've left lots of copies and drawings of that. In their copies, this is one, notice There's St. Matthew pointing at himself. He's not pointing at somebody else. Here's another one. This guy's a very interesting guy. Here again, Matthew pointing at himself. It looks like those people, and actually when they talked about it in the time period, no, they said Matthew is the guy that's pointing. One more piece of artistic evidence. This is a print of a copy of one of the Caravaggistas, and this is a copy of St. Matthew. And of course, what does it look like? It looks like the old guy in the painting. So I just want to show there's a bunch of artistic reasons to think, oh no, it doesn't make so much sense to say the young guy is St. Matthew. But what I really want to talk about, and then I'm getting there, I want to talk about the politics. And I think once you understand the politics of what's going on, you just say, I mean, at least Professor Groarke thinks, once you understand the politics, oh, that's why that's St. Matthew. So I have to thank Professor Schlachter. He translated this for me. It was some hard work because there's lots of abbreviations. What is this? This is the tombstone of Matthew Contraelli, the person who dedicated the money that was used to build the chapel. And he, in his will, he died earlier, but he left money in his will to have the chapel decorated, and it was for the Jubilee year. So this is very much his chapel. That's his tombstone. It's right there in the chapel on the floor. That's the name. Notice the window frame. That's the coat of arms of the Contraelli family. Okay. Again, and there's some other reasons here to think, you know, it's his chapel. By the way, it was his namesake. So, right, he wanted a chapel that was named after his patron saint, St. Matthew. Okay, there, in effect, there's his family crest. There, he's in the tomb there. He paid for all the paintings. And there he is. Boy, I had a hard time trying to find him. This is a print that was done from a painting. I've only was able to read about one painting that was made from him. As far as I can see, the painting may no longer be in existence. But what I want to suggest to you is really what's going on in the painting is if you look at that face, and I flipped it over, really, there's a reason why that old guy is presented there in the light, being called as a hero, as St. Matthew. And the reason really is political. And so let me read you a couple of things. Now, Caravaggio and people at that time, there was a book called The Golden Legends. That's where they got most of their information about the saints and whatever. What's the story about St. Matthew? He was a money guy. He was greedy. He was a functionary. He was a bureaucrat. He was dealing with money, and he was a bit shady. Caravaggio has sort of depicted him with his enforcers, but he was more than a bit shady, St. Matthew. But Jesus came, called him irresistible grace, and we can all be saved. Even if you're as wretched as Professor Groarke, you can be saved. Well, okay, this is a chapel dedicated to the memory of Matthew Contraelli. It's spelled different ways in the time period, so Contraelli. So it doesn't matter. We're talking about the same guy. Remember, this is for the Jubilee year. We want to put on a good face, Roman Catholicism. We want to sort of shine it up, make it look good, except there's a problem with our dear Cardinal Matthew. Here's the problem, and these are from history books. When the great Fortune, so he was a cardinal, he made a lot of money, he was a French cardinal, of course, had a mass, came to light at his death, he was accused by Gregory's reforming successor, Sixtus V, of simony, of selling church benefices. This was the most deplorable of ecclesiastical crimes. So he was a money guy in the Vatican, and as soon as he died, there was a big scandal. Where did he get all this money? The papal datary, that's what they called him, was in effect the ecclesiastical equivalent of an ancient publican. St. Matthew was a publican. He had the moral obligation to collect and transmit revenues fairly and honestly. But there was all this dirt about what's going on here. Everybody knew about it. So they had an inquiry. Pope Sixtus appointed a commission. After diligent investigation, it found so many simonies that one of the datary's assistants called to testify, fled, and thereby incriminated himself as well as his former patron. The inquest continued and uncovered from the Italian very aromatic material, smelly stuff. It stunk, in which many officials of the datary were implicated, even Pope Gregory himself, who it was suspected had known of the malfeasance of this French foreigner and his minister. There was a threat to confiscate the entire legacy. It was discovered that a certain colleague had usurped the income from 70 French monasteries. The Pope had destined the money for a construction of St. Louis, which received, like, we're talking about 30,000 scudi. The church only got 3,000. It also emerged that Quantarelle had assigned pensions from Spanish benefices to non-existent persons, which he then counts. Isn't that nice? You know, the church money is going to this person who doesn't exist. And so the accountant gets to be able to take the money, which he then canceled, retaining the income for himself. The investigation discovered, by the way, and this is an investigation to a French cardinal. The Pope really wants to be careful with the French because he's worried he's going to lose them to the Protestants. This is political too. What did they do? They squelched the investigation. In fact, the investigation risked jeopardizing the Holy See's relations with France. Pope Sixtus finally thought best to suppress the whole issue, though not without a stern warning of prosecution, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, one more. Actually, I think this is Elliot Wise. I think he captures it, but he doesn't quite get what's going on. Here's another description of Cardinal Contrelli. Caravaggio's commission came in the wake of a posthumous indictment against Cardinal Contarelli for abusing his high position as papal datary by funneling large sums of church money into his own pocket. Contrelli's heirs, embarrassed by the crime, likely instructed Caravaggio to make paintings into a kind of public penance for the late cardinal. Okay, there's this dirty, nasty cardinal, and what are we going to do? Oh, you're painting, you know, in the chapel. Is let's find a way to, to change his reputation, to rehabilitate him. That's what's going on in the chapel. By depicting Matteo Contrelli's name, Saint Matthew, Caravaggio uses the story of the evangelist's conversion as a model for the cardinal's restitution. The converting call of the painting is also the confession of another Matthew, the cardinal fixated on money to such an extent that he became a 17th century incarnation of the hated tax collectors employed by ancient Rome. Petitions were made for Contrelli's soul at the altar in his chapel, and the surrounding paintings voiced the hope that the light of Christ might reach even the soul of Cardinal Matteo suffering in purgatory. Anyways, so we've got somebody here who was like a publican, who was a dirty accountant, who was doing stuff. And what's going on in the painting? What is going on in the painting? He has a conversion, like the original Saint Matthew. I wanted to read one other thing 5, yes. This is the Golden Legend, and it's talking about St. Matthew, and it's talking about what the moral we should take from the story. And this is the moral. Yet Matthew's repentance was so pleasing to the Lord that not only did he forgive him, but he also heaped his gifts upon him in greater abundance. Of the miser and money seeker, he made an apostle and an evangelist, so that none that wishes to be converted may despair of pardon when grace wrought such wonders to such great sinners. So what's going on in the painting? Cardinal Matteo, Cardinal Matthew, Cardinal Contralli, Cardinal Quantrell, however you want to call him. He's depicted, I think for Caravaggio, this is deeply meaning. I'm saying there's a political thing going on. We're going to rehabilitate the reputation of this guy. But how is he rehabilitated? He's giving money. He's giving money for the decoration, for art, for the chapel. And that's how he gets his salvation. In a way, he's like the evangelist. The evangelist writes, you know, the stories of the Bible. But this cardinal, and I think he felt very guilty at the end of his life. He left a huge sum of money, decorate the chapel, and what Caravaggia's doing. It's a very slick political move. That guy, that's who he's supposed to represent. That means it has to be the old guy in the painting. That's who Matthew is. And we find that by doing what? By looking at the politics around around the era, around the epoch, or, what's going on. It's interesting. You can try to solve our history question by looking at politics is important. It permeates everything we do. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went on a bit. Yes, Lavinia.
Great talk.
Okay, thank you.
Can I be the devil's advocate?
Sure.
And say the fact that so many
Portraits.
people are at the end of the finger.
Yes.
Of Jesus' finger. Wouldn't you say that maybe Caravaggio, knowing all the history of this cardinal, took revenge, his personal revenge, by making it like a confusing type of indication of the identity? Because it could be that that Jesus' finger is pointing to the other guy.
Okay.
So in other words, this how did you call it when Matthew is
the vocation, the calling, la vocation.
It's passing the road.
Okay. Oh, can I show a couple more pictures? Do I have your permission? Yeah, it's an excellent question. By the way, I don't think, you're doing history. These are interpretations. There's no, definitive proof one way or the other, but I've tried to make the case that this makes the most sense. Let me add something, okay, that it may convince you, may not. The usual idea is that in the painting, the usual traditional interpretation is those figures that have light on them are converting to Jesus. And the people in the dark are not converting to Jesus. So let's see if I can get this. Oh, it's not working anymore. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you remember the painting. I want to show you, Lavinia, Caravaggio often used, again, as artists always do, examples from other artists. I want to show you where Caravaggio, and this isn't me, this is known in the art history community. It's not working. I need a slide. Yeah. This is where Caravaggio, this is accepted in art history community. This is where, what I want you to do is look at that figure right there. The general thought is maybe this figure too, but particularly that figure. Here's another, Okay, this is these are prints, okay? This is a print, there was a print of the Dance Macabre by Hans Holbein, the younger, and it became famous and people made reproductions of it all over the place and all the rest.
This one.
Okay, oh, I've got the wrong one, all right. Story of my life. That is generally thought. You've got the table, you've got the bent over figure, the ruffian, whatever. I'm going to partly agree with you, partly disagree, Lavinia. And if you look, you couldn't see this at the painting, you'll notice, and they knew this at the time, this guy is stealing money. There are coins under, oops. I'll go back here. There, actually, I forget it. Right here, you can see he's pulling a bunch of money in from the table. There's death, and death is taking away one of the card players from whatever. In this painting right here, we have the same kind of bent over, crouched figure over the table, and he's counting money, and he's stolen some money right here. And there's an accountant right there that's looking and is very upset, like what's going on. By the way, there's more to the painting than I am suggesting. Now, of course, I've always thought about this. If you want to be really mean, Lavinia, you could say, really, there's the cardinal. And he's kind of, you know, playing games. You know, the other artists would have known sort of where this came from or whatever. This is about the central figure being pulled down by death. Well, is it possible that Caravaggio is being ironic? Is it possible that, you know, he's got to put on this great display for his patrons? It's possible. I actually, having looked at a lot of Caravaggio, don't think that's what's going on, but it could be. I'll give you that. Yeah. Zoe?
My question is, why do you think the Pope disagrees with what you're saying, that the younger man?
Because I think it's very moving, because the figure at the end of the table is, you know, if you want to emphasize sinfulness and the possibility of redemption, even if you're sinful, this is a beautiful painting, and the man is brooding, he's counting his money, and I think it's very meaningful. What the Pope and people arguing on that say as well, you know, this is really, salvation is around the door, it hasn't come yet, and I think that's a very meaningful, deep message to most of us who are, we're not quite glorious and an evangelist or whatever, and so I think that's the attraction of that. Again, the traditional view, here's a description of the painting by Giovanni Bellori, who is the first person who describes the painting. On the right side of the altar, one can see Christ calling St. Matthew for his apostolic mission. Other figures are painted in a very natural manner, notably the saint who has stopped counting his money, one hand to his chest, and is now turning toward the Lord. And that's the main figure, the traditional figure, the old guy, whatever. By his side is an old man putting on his glasses and observing a young man sitting at the table who is grabbing a few coins. I think, and you know, of course, you might be right, Lavinia, maybe there's irony here, but I don't think that Caravaggio could have intended, with all the scandals surrounding Cardinal Matteo, it could have represented him as somebody who was actively in the business of stealing. That just doesn't make political sense. So, but of course, Lavinia, there might be a covert thing going on, as you suggest. Yes,
So
I guess I take them.
you say stealing. When I see it, I see a little shade.
Let's see if do I have a, he's also, I don't know if you see, he's got a money bag. He's not looking up at the light. He's looking down. He's, the coins are on the table, they're counting him. The guy's in behind him looking like, hey, what's going on? In other copies of this too, you see the people are disturbed, and hidden under his hand are a few pennies. That is the traditional way of looking at the painting. I think that's what Caravaggio intended to be happening. Again, if you want to say it's St. Matthew, well, it's just St. Matthew. He hasn't kind of emerged into the light yet. Okay, Sharon,
Hi, yeah.
thank you for coming.
What do you say that our new interpretation is that this guy's saying that?
Yes.
I would say that came out of sometime in the 1970s and was almost universally denied by almost every other piece of art historian.
I do agree with you that it's sort of the wind has a little bit gone out of it. But, you know, I've got about 10, 12 sources where they're adamant that, yeah. But I think it's important, nevertheless, to understand how do you understand what's going on? What you have to understand is, and I'm not, by the way, this is a religious painting. It's a meaningful religious painting. It's a drama about, you know, evil and good and calling and all the rest. But my point is we need to place it also within the political situation to agree with that.
When you say art historians, there's lots of ways to look at painting the formal way, the materials way. Art historians do that, but for at least over a century, art historians have been looking at politics.
Yeah, of course, of course.
And this one has been significantly studied in that way, in particular by Troy Thomas, who you mentioned.
Yes, who I've been in contact with. Yeah, sure, of course.
And his article in 2006 said quite a lot of what you're talking about.
It did, but it didn't hone in on this idea about Cardinal Matteo and the financial misdealing and the Matthew as sort of, you know, as a stand-in, if you will, as a way to rehabilitate it. But you're right. He's the person that mentions about the fleur de lis in the.
The Cardinal left a great deal of money in his will. He died in 1985. He left a lot of money in his will before this chapel was decorated.
Yes.
And he said very clearly what he wanted in there.
Yes.
And one of the things was a statue of St. Matthew, which he didn't get because the other was made was projected by.
Well, actually, half of that statue still exists.
Yeah, but it's not in the chapel.
I know, but I mean, remember, he's dead, and there was a statue, and the statue shows somebody at an accounting book because it's St. Matthew. It's interesting as to why that statue was rejected. A possible reason is it was rejected because it brought too much attention to the Cardinal's financial accounting malfeasance. Yeah.
I also just want to point out Matthew's patron saint, my two country's patron saint is Matthew.
Yeah.
So that's why St. Matthew is being represented in these paintings, and the Cardinal knew he was a part
Of course.
Yes.
So
that's why.
But Sharon, of course, but yeah, but so what art is made up of a happy happenstance, circumstances that come together so that artists in all sorts of interesting ways put together. And yes, this guy's patron saint is Matthew. And okay, you've got this commission and there's all this stuff going around, and that's what artists do. They're very clever and smart. Caravaggio, for other reasons too. You know, he was a new painter in Rome. He was trying to make a reputation. He had patrons to please. He had to, you know, it's kind of like being a country singer in Nashville. You got to make a splash. Okay, so sure, all that stuff is true. But there's also something going on that we need to recognize about the politics behind it. Yes? Oh, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Your thesis, which I think is very sensitive, that there are two levels of conflict. One, what I might call the macro conflict, and the macro conflict, two women do at the time.
Yeah, that's right.
And church functionary and financier.
Okay,
And the evidence you presented is really fascinating. When I looked at some those things, I didn't see that what the level of detail and what for the instrument can do. Or
right,
what I want to add is something in defense of confidence.
okay. Oh, yes,
And you said to the same thing, demonstrate,
yes,
and that involves actually there is a definition for this. You found it mysterious, but there is a definition for this that coffee was called the drink of the devil at that time
right.
because there was another macro conflict over there. And
Uh.
that was conflict with the Ottomans, the Muslim Ottomans, and the Catholic Church.
Right,
And coffee was brought by Muslims to Cairo from Yemen and from Ethiopia, and then it became very popular in Istanbul. And from Istanbul went to Vienna, and then invaded the whole Christian world. And as an economist, I have also add another piece of information that the Germanic word, beer makers,
yes,
were very important in calling it the drink of the devil because it was competing with beer.
right. So drink beer instead of the drink of the devil. Yeah.
So I think this supports to keep it by invoking other agents which are rising bourgeoisie, the beer makers, and so on. So there is a class context for that interpretation, but there is also the macro conflict which you was looming there, which involves the need of the different things. I like talking.
Okay, Sal, I'll just say generally, you know more about coffee than I do. Yes, this kind of synthesis of a whole bunch of different things going on many levels: economic, financial, political, artistic, literary, whatever, philosophical. Yeah, that's what happens. And then we get these artifacts that are thrown up in history, and we have to try to understand them with all this swirling kinds of different, different factors. Events and powers that are going on in the world. In other words, politics is always there, this struggle to control society by different groups. Thank you. Yes, Carl.
Maybe worse than devil's advocate. for the
Okay.
immigration gas. But what building are we in right now?
The Brian Mulroney Hall. Yes.
I'm just making that observation in terms of the.
Okay. Okay. There is a painting out there, by the way, but all right. Yes, go ahead. Whoever.
I was wondering, what painting, let's say in the last 50 years, is being studied by the future art historians?
Oh, oh, there's so, a very hard question to ask. There's so much art. What I would say, let me make a very general comment. I think that much of the commercial the art market has become a very commercialized, almost industrialized kind of affair. I think much of what is talked about right now is not going to be very important. Eventually, who knows, maybe there's somebody in a garret, in an attic somewhere, doing something that we don't know about, or in some, in some little village or wherever. But there's just too much to say. I can't really pick out a particular work. I'll think about that. Send me an email and I'll think about it for a bit. Yes. Yes.
So with the cardinal, it seems there are a lot of that things that we just wanted to.
I'm sorry, Emily, I can't.
So it seemed like with the cardinal, whenever the person who was paying for the painting wanted would end up in it. So I'm wondering, you could still more political views of like commissioner of the artist.
My understanding is that the contracts for the paintings were quite vague. They would ask for a painting of a certain subject matter. I have actually read a couple of the contracts, and they say something like, and the painter will, according to his novel interpretation, see as he sees fit. There may be cases where it's much more specific. So clearly, as Professor Gregory was saying, this is a chapel dedicated to the namesake of Cardinal Matteo. And so, of course, there have to be paintings about Matthew. But as to the exact details, the artists were given a lot of free rein. Caravaggio was a guy who, I mean, where he came from Milan, from the north of Italy. He was very clever. He spent a lot, it seems, and he was very secretive about how he worked. He seems he spent a lot of time thinking about how he was going to paint something. So the idea was that there was a concetto, an idea that the artist was supposed to come up with. And he seems to, sometimes there are stories that he went away for a couple months just thinking about how he was going to paint this painting, whatever. But the actual contracts, the contracts that I've seen, going to paint a Virgin Mary, in a nativity scene surrounded by animals. That's the ones that I've seen. And so it isn't precise. By the way, a lot of his paintings were rejected because he was a little bit edgy. Sometimes suppose people argue about why, for lack of decorum, because it didn't quite fit the subject matter, because it's theologically inaccurate. The painting of Saint Anne and Mary and the boy Jesus, I don't know if you noticed, Jesus is uncircumcised. Why is he uncircumcised in that painting? Well, because probably Caravaggio, who's known to work from life, he probably took a little boy and he painted him. But of course, theologically, Jesus was circumcised. So that painting actually, as I recall, is no longer, it wasn't rejected from that church. So it was kind of a mix of things that happened, but, Caravaggio wouldn't have been told, okay, take sort of a resemblance of the cardinal and put him there. He wouldn't have been, no, that's all him figuring all sorts of things. Or he wouldn't have been told, put Jesus with a hand from the Sistine Chapel. No, that's all him figuring out. Or use this print. No, that's him figuring out. And when it works, it doesn't always work. He's very, very good at that. Yes, Professor Sweet.
Thanks, Wade. That's very interesting. But I'm just going to bring you back to the first definition of art.
Okay.
And so here's my question. Does the correct identification of Matthew affect the aesthetic experience?
My view is that, yes, it does. That's my view.
I don't know this, and I see that painting in Rome.
Yeah.
My experience is superior to your looking at it.
Well, those, Professor Sweet, those are loaded terms. What you subjectively feel is your own business, and it might be, and if Pope Francis feels deeply, I do think Caravaggio is a very fetching painter, and I can see somebody taking the interpretation I've disagreed with and running with it and being, but look, it's a little bit like this. And so what's the larger project? Because after all, I'm a philosopher. If you took a Christmas card You know, Christmas cards have pictures on them, and we don't realize that there's an iconography that was developed over the years to depict him as a. And you said, "Oh, that guy on the camel, that's Joseph." Well, and you might have a meaningful relationship with the guy on the camel that's bringing gifts and everything, but it's not Joseph. Yes, but
But you said art is a skillful display intended for enjoyment and contemplation.
that's right.
Okay, so I don't know the name of this work of art. So in what way does knowing this make enjoyment and contemplation?
Because I think, you know, it's like when you, but if I can just finish my point about the Christmas card, somebody who thinks that one of the kings is Joseph has made a cognitive mistake, and they're not appreciating what the artist is about. Of course, you can, you know, we have ancient Greek statues, and we might not know what mythological god is that represent. And you can look at the statue, it's got a certain form, it's got a certain craftsmanship. You can enjoy it, you can contemplate it. But I would say if you want to get the most you can from a work of art, then it helps to get those things right. So, you know, there's a postmodern view out there about this painting, actually. And it's quite prevalent in the literature. Well, it's just all ambiguous and you can't know. And it does get one thing right, that Caravaggio is pretty sneaky, and he's got this kind of spooky supernaturalism, which is hard to, I think he wants us to feel that. But my position would be is that paintings are cognitive. And so that there is an aspect of knowledge, there is an aspect of understanding, you know, for example, who is in the painting, who's doing what, what's going on. By the way, there's more to this painting than I've talked about, this particular painting, but just painting in general, at least when we're talking about representational symbolic painting, that's really what I'm talking about. And the way to appreciate, for example, Durer's, you know, Adam and Eve, is to start to understand what's behind it. And I think that adds to the enjoyment, and that adds to the way we can better contemplate the works of art. But of course, we can just appreciate pictorially works of art that we don't understand. Yes.
I think we've talked about.
Okay. Donna, did you have a quick?
It's really sort of not coherent yet, but that kind of presumes, not a lot of them. That kind of
No.
presumes that there's like a single one way that the artist intended to produce the piece of art, and a single one way that it's correctly received. And I struggle with that because I am slightly postmodern, I guess, and it doesn't leave much space for like reader or art reception.
I think that's a good point. And actually, I think it's interesting, Donna, because I think in some paintings, Caravaggio is purposely paradoxical, or I talk about layers of meanings. And so there are some paintings which are purposely ambiguous, where there are things hidden, where there are things where there's a actually what Lavinia pointed out, you know, once you see the print and then you start to wonder, well, is there something going on here that's maybe hidden or whatever? So I accept that. I do agree, one has to leave as much room as possible for, you know, for aesthetic appreciation. But I would still say there's a cognitive, you know, when art works well, we understand it and then we appreciate it more. You know, there isn't one exact fixed kind of way to respond to this painting, but getting the sort of general main story, what the schema figured out, I think is helpful.
I just want to point out something. Umberto Eco, he wrote, he published The Name of the Rose. A lot of people interpreted the medieval things as postmodern, and the postmodern is medieval. And he pointed out that you're all wrong. So, you know, like, in other words, you know, people sometimes, that they can pose, that's why reconstruction is problematic, right? people impose their will on something, and often, to use my term, retroject. And that is a problematic thing too. So, Umberto, that's what I think, some of this.
Can I just finish by saying, Donna, I do think it's not quite that postmodernism is all wrong. Actually, no, because Joseph seems to be suggesting that there is.
I'm suggesting that if you see already existing.
There is a place in paintings for ambiguity, for indefiniteness. There's a kind of aesthetic use of things that are vague and that's legitimate and that's right. And I think there are different layers of meaning. For example, I think this is a deeply religious painting. Nevertheless, I've tried to use anyways politics to sort of understand it better. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Anna Zuschlag, I'm the program research manager at the Mulroney Institute of Government on behalf of our grateful host. I have one thing to say and one way to mean it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Our thanks, and unfortunately, the swords and the implements of torture were on backwards.
Okay.
So we'll have to do with the mug.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.